If I were going to learn another language, what would I do differently? So when I was in school, I was an Italian major, and naturally things are very different now than when I graduated. There's so many more opportunities to learn, and also I've just learned a lot more about ways that people learn languages and acquire them and techniques that can be helpful. So this is just going to be a quick list of 5 things I would do differently now if I were going to learn a new language. Probably the first thing is I would spend the first 3 or 4 weeks just focusing on pronunciation. Now I know that lots of students, when they start learning, the very first day they're encouraged to speak, trying to make sentences, organize thoughts, and that's great. But what I see with a lot of students is by the time they get to advanced levels, those problems that they had with pronunciation have persisted and in some ways gotten worse because they've learned a system that doesn't work or a system that's not quite right. And if you learn a habit, it's much harder to remove it. So I would suggest for a new language, really spending 3 or 4 weeks and just focusing on the pronunciation, get the basics down, the fundamentals, especially vowel sounds or consonants. You also want to focus on the rhythm, get an idea of how the language sounds, ideally with a native speaker or with someone who understands your language and your target language. The second thing I would do is I would make smarter flashcards. Nowadays, there's so many more opportunities you can use. There are apps like Memrise and Quizlet, and these are great because they use spaced repetition. You can also use a program called Anki, if you haven't heard of that. I personally like Memrise or Quizlet more because aesthetically they just look a little better. But they're all using the same fundamentals with spaced repetition. That is, the words that you study, if you get them correct, you see them less often, you study them less often in the app. But the words you get wrong, you see more often, you study them more in the application. So I would definitely suggest using those. They're extremely helpful. But I would also suggest making paper flashcards too. On those flashcards, you want to try to create as many associations as possible. I've made a video about how to make flashcards effectively so that way you can remember the words for the long term. And if you have more questions about that, I definitely suggest checking out that video. But one of the big keys from that is trying to make a drawing of the definition. So if you learn a word, try to draw a picture of what the word means to you. Speaking of applications, there's also so many more applications available for practicing speaking. For instance, if you're trying to find some language partners, one of the sites where I do some teaching, italki.com, they actually have a language partner tab, which you can see here. So that way you can find people who want to share their language with you and you can share your language with them. Other applications that do similar things are HelloTalk, which I've had great experiences with when I was more active on it, especially if you can find a group of people there that are interested in your language and you're interested in their language. So again, the group function is great. Another option is also Tandem. I have not actually tried Tandem and I've heard mixed things about it, but it may be worth investigating. I would also suggest being more active with the passive skills. Your passive skills are listening and reading. And if you think you're just reading something and improving, or just listening to something like watching a movie or listening to a podcast, and you think, oh wow, this is great, I'm really getting better, you can speed up the process so much more by being a little bit more active, setting goals for yourself. For instance, you can say, oh, by the time I finish listening or watching, I want to have written down 3 new words or 3 new expressions, or I want to see how often I can identify a certain preposition, like the word in. You know, setting these little goals for yourself when you're listening can also just make the process so much more effective and efficient for you. If you just listen or if you just read, that's not really enough because you're not really engaging with what you're doing. By setting these goals, you can really speed up the process. A good place to start is the next time you listen to something, try to identify 3 new words or expressions that you currently do not use in your own speaking or your own writing. Speaking of challenges, one of the last challenges that I really pushed myself to try to do more of, especially when I was living in Italy for a time, was to make more mistakes. One of my favorites was to set a limit. So be like, okay, before I go to bed today, I have to make 50 mistakes. Or before I go to bed, I have to make 80 mistakes in the language that I'm speaking. This type of goal I think can help really develop a stronger positive relationship with mistakes. I think a lot of people are scared of them, afraid of them. So what that does is it kind of stops you from speaking, or it makes you feel a lot less comfortable. If you change the approach though, you make mistakes something to embrace, something to try to reach or to try to make more of to help improve. It can help make that relationship a little bit more positive and also help you learn a lot more. So again, these are just the things I would be considering if I were learning a language again. Hopefully I can get back to it. I had been studying Chinese for a bit, but then I had my son, and for those of you who have kids and are learning a language, my hat's off to you, because that is a long, difficult process and very tiring. So I hope to get back to it in the future, and I'm definitely going to be taking a look at these steps as well. Let me know as well, what are some steps that you use in your own language learning that you think has been especially helpful for you and that maybe other people don't know about?